What we do here is go back.
Good day everyone, praise be Jesus and Mary. As for this video, we will tackle an approach under normative ethics, specifically the deontological ethics from the perspective of Immanuel Kant. Thus, this video will revolve primarily on Kantianism. But before we proceed to our actual discussion, let us first lay down the general information that revolves around Kantian ethics.
As previously mentioned, deontology is one of the three approaches to normative ethics, along with virtue ethics and consequentialism. Normative ethics refers to a person's attempt to find a decision procedure, a moral algorithm, rules or principles that might help him or her to decide in particular cases and come up with reasoned moral judgments. Thus, studying normative ethics is vital since it allows us to possess moral thinking and reasoning whenever we encounter problems, especially those that involve ethical dilemmas.
Now let's proceed to the discussion of deontology. To understand this word easily, let us define deontology based on its etymology. Deontology came from the Greek words deon, which means duty, and logos, which means study or science. Therefore, deontology denotatively means the study or science of duty. However, allow us to expound the definition further, since it is too vague to facilitate the understanding. So when we say deontology, it refers to the ethical theory that utilizes rules to distinguish right from wrong. It requires the person to follow their duty by doing what is right or what is defined by the laws, regardless to its consequences or outcomes. When we tackle deontology, it is often associated with the renowned philosopher Immanuel Kant. He believed that the action or ethical actions conform to the universal moral laws such as don't cheat, don't steal, and don't lie. Now that we have enlightened ourselves regarding to the general concepts of deontological ethics, let us view the theory through the lens of the Kantian philosophy.
Immanuel Kant is a brave German Enlightenment philosopher who wrote the paper entitled Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, which is regarded as his primary contribution to moral philosophy. Kantianism is classified under deontological philosophy since his arguments revolve that people must act from duty for them to act in a morally right manner. In the first chapter of Kant's Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, he established a philosophical perspective towards morality by distinguishing the only thing in the universe that is considered as unconditionally good and the things that are only conditionally good, since they solely depend on the unconditionally good that enable them to be regarded as truly good. According to Kant, the goodwill is the only thing that is unconditionally good in this world, where conditionally good actions are dependent. People possess actions, talents, behaviors, or qualities that are conditionally good in themselves, since their goodness depends on the faculty that uses them. They are treated as conditionally good because people can also use these attributes as something that is opposite to goodness. Thus, for them to be genuinely considered as good, these actions must spring from the faculty of goodwill, which is unconditionally good in itself.
Our will serves as a foundation of our intentions in every action and quality that we do and possess respectively. Thus, our goodwill is the one that puts the intrinsic goodness in our intentions without regarding the possible outcomes of a particular action. It means that goodwill is good in itself and does not need any qualification to be considered good. It is good simply because of how it wills. Therefore, the goodness of good will lies in the action's intentions and not in the consequences that it may bring about. Furthermore, Kant claims that we can only possess goodwill if we act following the moral law's demands. However, we can only do so if our reason abides with the universal moral law. For Kant, the true purpose of our reason is to hone our ability to generate a will that is good in itself. In the subsequent pages of Kant's work, he stated that the concept of will is present in the concept of duty. Thus, we can extract the idea that Kant used the concept of goodwill as the foundation in establishing his proposition for morality, specifically for deontological ethics.
Kant generated three propositions that present the alignment between the act of duty and morality. The first proposition states that, for an action to have a genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. This means that, to achieve a genuinely good action, one has to act upon the duty to do good and not for some other reasons. Furthermore, a person must do an action in accord with the duty that is done directly from duty. Thus, they must not commit actions that are clearly opposed to duty, nor actions that are merely in accord with duty but are done for other selfish purposes. To illustrate the first proposition, let us give you these two example scenarios. For our first example, suppose that a man reports his friend who committed a heinous crime to receive the bounty placed on his friend's head. Although his action is in accord with his duty and aided the government to eliminate societal crimes, it is not genuinely moral since his action sprung from selfish purposes. As for a second example, suppose that a man is very cold and innately apathetic to the point that he does not feel fulfillment in showing kindness to other people. Despite these attributes, he still continues to help other people since he is driven by his duty to be kind to people. In this example, the man's action possesses true moral content. Although he takes no delight in doing so, he still continues to act in accordance with his duty since it is the universally right thing to do.
Next, the second proposition of Kant states that an action that is done from duty does not get its moral value from the purpose that is to be achieved through it, but from the maxim it involves. In other words, our actions are judged not by the purpose that they were meant to carry out, but rather by the principles that serves as its motivation. For it is the principles with which it was thought up, and not the goals it achieves or fails to accomplish, that makes it morally worthy. For example, suppose one undertakes an action to yield a particular result. In that case, it implies that they possess a motivation beyond duty itself. Therefore, this action cannot have a moral value. On the other hand, if a woman enabled her goodwill to act upon the necessity to follow a moral principle, then her actions are morally good.
Lastly, Kant's third postulation states that to have a duty is to be required to act in a certain way out of respect for the law. In other words, moral actions are generated out of one's reverence for the law. We need to bear in mind that this law, in this sense, should be universal and not something situational or specific. Also, the term reverence, in this case, it refers to a person's moral motivation since he/she recognizes that the law is an imperative of a reason that transcends all other interests and concerns. Therefore, this means that a rational being can recognize the moral law and act according to it, despite of his or her situation or circumstance. Furthermore, he/she can understand and act according to the law through the maxim, or the subjective motivating principle, which he/she imposes on him or herself for the basis for his or her will. According to Kant, genuine goodness will follow this law, regardless of the person's desires, since it serves as the principle where we anchor our actions, and whoever acts from duty is acting from formal principle than inclination, since one cannot utilize consequence to determine moral action under Kantianism, the only principle that can determine the will towards unconditional goodness is to act in a manner that his or her actions could be the basis for the standard universal law.
In summary, Kant argued that the highest good must be good in itself, meaning it is intrinsically good without qualifications. Thus, morally good actions spring from the goodwill, the only thing that is absolutely good altogether. With this, Kant claims that a person can only possess the goodwill if he or she acts in accordance with the demands of the moral law, wherein everyone has a duty to follow. Moreover, his construction of a moral law is a categorical imperative, which means that it acts on all people regardless of their innate desires and interests. Therefore, Kant argued that ethical actions conform to the universal moral laws.
For Kant, doing the right thing is not a matter of good character, moral intuition, or calculating the outcomes. Instead, moral actions are about acting out of a duty of respect for the moral law. It is because the moral law's form is categorical rather than conditional. Thus, he rejected any moral reasoning that relies on calculus to the effect that if you want to achieve some good outcome X, in circumstances Y, then you should do Z. Rather, the moral law is expressed in terms of categorical statements in the form of do this or do that.
With this, Kant suggested that the moral law can be stated in terms of what he called the categorical imperative, which states that act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can, at the same time, will that it becomes a universal law. Roughly speaking, it means that you should ask yourself whether the maxim, which refers to the rule or principle that connects an action to the reasons for the action, so you must ask yourself whether the maxim of your action can be used to establish a universal law that will govern not just your particular action, but everyone's actions who happen to encounter the same situation as you. Condensing this thought further, if you can imagine the maxim being universalized, then your action is morally right. If you cannot, then your action is immoral.
The second version of Kant's categorical imperative, renowned as a humanity formulation, states that we should never treat humanity as a means only, but always as an end in itself. This idea fits very closely to a very common moral intuition that may partially explain why we find the concept of scapegoating as something difficult to accept, although it seems to be justified in straightforward utilitarian terms. Then it would be much easier to make everyone agree that we all have our duties to always consider the humanity and autonomy of the people involved as we deal with them. But then again, Kant argued that if your actions maxim is inconceivable to become a universal law, then you have the perfect duty to refrain from acting upon it.
And that concludes the discussion about deontological ethics, taking the perspective of Immanuel Kant's philosophy. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope that you learned something from us.